Hello, and welcome to our video looking at some of the impacts of the Enlightenment period. Specifically, how did monarchs respond to this? And they're going to respond with this thing called enlightened despotism. In this video, we're going to look at a few different examples of enlightened despotism that happen kind of throughout Central and Eastern Europe. We're going to look at Prussia and the Fredericks, Austria with Maria Theresa and Joseph II, and then Russia with Catherine the Great. But before we can dive into our examples, we need to figure out what exactly is enlightened despotism. What does it look like? As we know, Enlightenment ideas are going to lead to all sorts of political reform across Europe and into the colonies. And in some cases, it leads to revolution. And most of these changes are going to be happening in Western Europe. But in Central and Eastern Europe, they're going to take a different approach. Rulers are going to view themselves as enlightened thinkers who could utilize their power to implement changes without actually really giving up any of that power. If you're thinking that sounds a little contradictory, you're right. It 100% is. They're kind of the equivalent of those people that like rage about climate change and like impacts to the environment, but still use, single use plastic water bottles. Like it just doesn't match. So, what are these enlightened despotists like looking to do? Well, they're looking to modernize their social institutions like education and religion. They're really trying to streamline their bureaucracy and better manage their resources. They're looking to increase trade and they want to do all of these things in a way that keeps them as the absolute monarch in their country. And most of the time, their subjects are okay with this as long as the social contract that's created, that idea that they should be protected through these absolute monarchs, is not violated. And I think this quote by Frederick II of Prussia really sums all of that up. He says, "My people and I have come to an agreement which satisfied us both. They are to say what they please, and I am to do what I please." So, just this idea that there is that balance between the ruler and their subjects, but ultimately it falls back on an absolute monarch. And here's a look at how this idea contrasts with that absolute mindset. So, usually, absolutists are looking to maintain their power by censoring free thought. And while many radical philosophers were exiled from France and England, they're welcomed into Central Europe, which is the current Holy Roman Empire. And these Enlightenment thinkers were often invited to court with these enlightened despots, people like Frederick the Great or Catherine the Great. They're going to meet with people like Voltaire and hear what they have to say and really enjoy, those conversations about enlightened thought. And it's through those conversations that these enlightened despots are going to kind of make some reforms within their empires. They really want what they're wanting to do is like kind of strengthen their own power through this. So they want to weaken the power of the church. And they think that by allowing more religious tolerance, that's a way to do that. They want to weaken the aristocracy. And so they try to give more support to kind of the lower classes at times to do that. They codify laws to support internal improvements. And they start to create some of those improvements like more access to education, bigger militaries, and more food production. Now that we've established what this kind of looks like, let's look at some specific examples, and we'll start with Prussia and the two Fredericks. And we'll start with Frederick William I. So you notice the dates at the top. These are going to be the dates that they reigned, not the dates for their lifetime. But Frederick William I, he's known as the Soldier King, and his whole kind of thing during his rule was that he wanted to create the most modern military. He doubles the size of the Prussian army, and he made them kind of, you know, a big force to be reckoned with. One of the things he tries to do is attempt lifelong conscription, which, as you can imagine, was very unpopular. This idea that if you're conscripted into the army, it's a lifelong service. He also starts to make members of the aristocracy officers in this new army, and they're known as junkers. And he does this for a few reasons. But the main one is that he thinks if he occupies them and creates this kind of loyalty to the state and the system, they're going to be more loyal. He also does things like establish schools and hospitals and stores grain and utilizes underused land for agriculture, creating more food production, which are all themes that we know enlightened despots do. And then comes his son, Frederick II, or Frederick the Great. And he takes that model of the army and he just, keeps going with it. He expands their lands into Austrian territories. He's going to do a lot of judicial reform as well. So judges will have to pass some exams before they can actually be a judge to make it like less impartial. He also is going to abolish torture, except, if you are accused of committing treason, in which case, like, it's okay. He also has a lot of conversations with Voltaire, and Voltaire actually comes to visit him. And through those conversations, he encourages the immigration of Jews and Huguenots to come to his land, which, if you remember, is part of the Holy Roman Empire at this time. So that's pretty influential that he's kind of looking more at freedom of religion in his state. Some other things he does is he builds this palace, this really beautiful palatial estate in the French Rococo style, called Sanssouci, that shows that he's also interested in the art and culture of the age. He starts to give junkers more privileges to control the peasant population, uh, but his main goal is really to keep his citizens happy. He reduces censorship and he abolishes serfdom during his time as the emperor here. And he's also going to utilize mercantilist economic policies, which, as we know, means like an economy directly controlled by the state. So there's another example of those, like, it's like he gives some things, but in other ways, the state is very much still in charge. Okay, now let's switch over to Austria and look at what enlightened despotism looks like for Maria Theresa and Joseph II. So we'll start with Maria Theresa. So she is a Habsburg ruler who comes to power after the War of Austrian Succession through this document called the Pragmatic Sanction, where basically her father did not have any male heirs, and he created this document that said she was allowed to inherit the empire. And it was basically just because they needed to ensure that a Habsburg still stayed in charge. So she gains the throne. And the rest of Europe, a lot of people don't like this because they don't like the idea of a woman being able to inherit and be in charge. Because remember, they don't have a lot of very fond feelings about women in power during this time. And one person that especially does not like this is the Fredericks of Prussia. And so they look to kind of get the land from her. They don't think that she should be in charge of it. So they're fighting against the Prussians for a long time at this point. And we see that she's going to look to try and regain land and power throughout her reign that she ends up losing to Prussia. And the other thing she's going to be doing during this reign is she's going to look to reduce the power of the Catholic Church, which is interesting because, she is a descendant of the Holy Roman Empire. So, some things that she does to regain power from the Catholic Church is she kicks out the Jesuits from her court. She refused to give up land to the Pope, and she attempts to convert Protestants to Catholicism and exile Jewish people. So she does not go the religious tolerance route that Prussia did. But some things that she does do: she reduces serfdom. She institutes mandatory education for all citizens. She sets up military and science academies. And she's one of the first rulers to try inoculating herself and her family against smallpox, basically, like kind of like vaccine in a way. They expose themselves to the disease in order to, prevent it from spreading. So that's pretty cool. She also sets up a police force and sets up Austria's first Supreme Court to handle judicial matters, which is pretty influential. And her ideas are really continued by her son, Joseph II, who will rule with her until her death, kind of starting in 1765. So he continues this by abolishing serfdom in 1781 with the Edict of Toleration. He continues to oversee the educational and police reforms enacted by his mom. He basically gets rid of monasteries that are not involved in education or healthcare. And again, trying to limit the influence of the Catholic Church. Some things he does do, though, is he enacted freedom of the press, religion, and many civil rights for his citizens, which will be a change from what his mom did. And then finally, we will look at Russia and Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great is a really interesting lady. So she's actually born in Prussia and marries Peter III, the descendant of Peter the Great. And Peter III was kind of seen as very immature. He was not considered very qualified to lead. And she eventually is able to stage a coup and usurp power from her husband. So she gets him to sign this document of abdication saying that he is no longer the king. She is now in charge. And then he kind of dies in custody from the people who performed the coup a few days later. So it's all this very dramatic abdication of power. So some things that she does: she grants nobility additional power over serfs. She has several military conquests that are successful for Russia, specifically conquest over the Ottoman Empire that gave Russia territory in the Black Sea, and the partition of Poland, which gives Russia additional land in the west, which they really greatly wanted. And Catherine is known for her interest in the French Enlightenment. She required people to speak French at court. She was very interested and read a lot from these great Enlightenment thinkers, especially people like Voltaire. And so she's considered an enlightened despot for implementing some limited reforms in Russia because of that interest. Here are some examples of her reforms. So she restricts torture. She encourages education, including for girls. She actually sets up some schools specifically for girls in Russia. She expands on Peter the Great's westernization policies by importing artists, musicians, and architects from Western Europe. And she tries to combat kind of old school superstitions and promote tolerance within her empire. But of course, her reforms are kind of limited in a lot of ways. She ends up granting way too much power to the elites in her society and not enough to the lower classes. She attempts to abolish serfdom, but ends up kind of creating it in places like Ukraine, where it had already been abolished for a while. And in her attempts to be tolerant towards the Jewish population, she kind of just moves them to other parts of the empire. And it ends up creating what's called the Jewish Pale, which basically are just some small states that have large populations of Jewish people living in them because she kind of like sends them out of Russia. And there's still a lot of violence and prejudice against Jewish people in her empire. Okay, just to wrap up our thoughts one more time. So, some major themes you should see from these enlightened despot examples we just looked at is that they will adopt some enlightenment principles without surrendering their power. These enlightened despots were selective in the reforms that they chose, and they usually included things like codifying laws, promoting education, reducing torture, and some religious toleration. And they typically do not support things like freedom of the press, free speech, or democratic principles because it's seen as a threat to their power. Okay, and that's the end of our time today. Hopefully, now you have a better understanding of enlightened despotism and some impacts to Enlightenment thought. Thanks for watching.